Silas Mercer snatched the jar right out of her hands. He didn't ask. He didn't warn her. He just reached across that market table, grabbed the only jar of preserves Mara Ellison had managed to sell that morning, and held it up in front of the whole crowd like it was evidence at a trial. "This," he said, loud enough for 3 rows of people to hear, "is what desperation looks like when it's wearing a label." He set it back down, hard, and the lid cracked. Mara didn't move. She couldn't. She just stood there with her hands still open, still shaped like they were holding something, while the town of Red Hollow watched and nobody said a word. $3. That's what she'd started with. 3 crumpled dollars and a wagon full of peaches everyone else had thrown away. And now the most powerful man in the county was laughing at her in public, and she was 1 cracked jar away from losing everything she had left. If that were you, standing there, hands empty, crowd watching, what would you do? If this story already has you feeling something, you're exactly the kind of person we made this for. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because the people who find this channel always come back for more. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far Mara's story travels. And stay with us, because what happens next will make your jaw drop. The hailstorm came on a Tuesday, and it didn't apologize for anything. It rolled in from the northwest just before noon, the kind of sky that turns green before it turns mean, and by the time the people of Red Hollow, Colorado understood what was happening, it was already happening to them. The hail came down the size of shooter marbles at first, then bigger, the size of walnuts, the size of plums, hammering every rooftop and every field and every living thing that couldn't find cover fast enough. It lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes was enough. When it stopped and the sky opened back up into that clean, mocking blue that always follows destruction, the peach orchards east of town looked like something a giant had walked through in boots. Branches stripped to pale wood, fruit knocked from every tree, lying in the mud in pieces, bruised purple, and split open, already drawing flies. 3 weeks before harvest. 3 weeks before the money that would have carried most of these families through winter. Gone. Mara Ellison stood at the edge of what had been her small, rented plot and looked at the ground for a long time without saying anything. She didn't have the luxury of crying right then. Crying was for later, for after dark, for when no one in Red Hollow could see her face and add it to the list of reasons she deserved what she got. She was 37 years old and she had been a widow for 2 years. And in a town like Red Hollow, that combination, widow, no man, no family money, bigger than the women who seemed to matter, meant that the margin between her and disaster had always been tissue thin. She knew that. She had always known that. She just hadn't expected the disaster to arrive on a Tuesday in the form of ice falling from a blue sky. She walked back to the farmhouse. It wasn't her farmhouse. It was Henry Calloway's farmhouse, and she rented it by the month, and the rent was due in 12 days. She sat down at the kitchen table and she counted what she had. This was not a figure of speech. She actually took the money out of the ceramic pot above the stove, and she laid it on the table and she counted it, $3.41. She counted it again, $3.41. She sat with that number for a while the way you sit with news you already knew was coming but still weren't ready to hear. Outside, she could hear the sound of Red Hollow starting to assess its losses, men calling to each other across fences, a woman somewhere crying, not bothering to hide it, wagon wheels moving slow, the way they move when people are looking at damage instead of going somewhere. Her nearest neighbor, Dottie Plum, appeared at the back door without knocking, which was Dottie's way. "It's bad," Dottie said. She was 62 and she had been farming this valley since before Mara was born, and she said it the way people say true things, flat, without decoration. "I know," Mara said. "Silas is already out buying up the damaged lots." Mara looked up. Dottie leaned against the doorframe. "Paying pennies. You know how he works. Tells people it's charity, buying fruit nobody else wants. Then he sells it to the canneries in Denver for 3 times what he paid and calls it commerce." Silas Mercer was the produce tycoon of the Red Hollow Valley, which was a formal way of saying he was the man who had figured out, years ago, that if you controlled what farmers sold and what buyers paid and what got transported on which wagons along which roads, you controlled everything else too. He wasn't from Red Hollow originally. He'd arrived 20 years ago with money from somewhere nobody talked about, and he'd built his operation with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the best kind of power is the kind people don't recognize until it already has them. He didn't like Mara. He had never made a secret of that. She couldn't entirely explain why. She wasn't important enough to be a real threat to him, not yet. But she had a theory. Silas Mercer was a man who believed that certain people were supposed to stay in certain places, and Mara had a habit, even broke and struggling, of not staying where she was put. "He won't buy mine," Mara said. Dottie looked at her. "He doesn't want yours. He wants the big lots, the Hensley farm, the Garrett boys, the places with enough volume to be worth his time." She paused. "Your damage is too small to interest him. He'll let you rot." That word, rot, sat in the room for a moment. "Dottie," Mara said slowly, "how much damaged fruit is still on the Gaines lot? Old Eli Gaines, the one who left for his daughter's place in Pueblo last month?" Dottie thought about it. "Eli had maybe, I don't know, 4 big trees near the road. He wasn't going to harvest them anyway. He told me that before he left. His hands aren't what they were." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because Silas Mercer is going to walk past those trees," Mara said, "and he's not going to bother with them. 4 trees worth of bruised peaches isn't worth his wagon space." "Mara, what's Eli asking for that lot's fruit?" "He's not asking for anything. He walked away from it." "Mara, that fruit is already bruised. Half of it is on the ground. The rest is split or marked or so soft you can push your thumb through them." "I know." "You cannot sell damaged fruit at market. People won't buy it." "I'm not going to sell fruit." Dottie stared at her. Mara looked down at the $3.41 on the table. She thought about her mother. She thought about a recipe written in pencil on the back of a church bulletin that she had carried in the bottom of her trunk through every move she'd made since she was 19 years old, never thinking she'd use it, keeping it the way you keep things from people who are gone. "My mother made preserves," Mara said. "Not the kind you buy at a general store, the real kind, the kind where you can taste that the person making it was paying attention." She paused. She had a recipe. Spices, technique, a particular way of breaking down damaged fruit so that the bruising doesn't ruin it. It actually changes it, concentrates the sugar. She said the best preserve she ever made came from the peaches her neighbor almost threw away. Dottie was quiet for a moment. "You have $3, she said. "Enough to buy what Eli won't miss," Mara said. "And then what?" "Jars. I have jars. I have the stove. I have the recipe." She looked up at Dottie. "I have time. I have nothing but time right now." Dottie crossed her arms. She looked at the money on the table. She looked at Mara. She had known Mara Ellison for 6 years, and she had watched her get knocked down with a regularity that would have flattened most people. And she had also watched her get up each time with that particular expression on her face. Not defiance, exactly, not stubbornness, exactly, but something more like the look of a person who has decided to see what happens if they just keep going. "I have a wagon," Dottie said finally. "I know you do." "I'm not saying yes. I know that too." Dottie uncrossed her arms. "I'll bring it around after supper." They loaded the damaged peaches in the late afternoon, when the light was already going orange and the air had that post-storm clarity that makes everything look sharper than it is. Mara and Dottie working quiet and steady, filling crates with fruit that was split and marked and soft in places, fruit that had been knocked from the tree before its time, that had hit the ground and kept going, that bore the marks of everything the storm had done to it. It was not beautiful work. The peaches bled their juice through the crate slats. Mara's hands were sticky to the wrist inside of 10 minutes. She worked without complaining about it because complaining required a kind of energy she was rationing right now. She didn't see Silas Mercer's wagon until she heard the horses. His rig was bigger than Dottie's, but it was always bigger, that was the point. And it came down the road from the direction of the Hensley farm with the slow confidence of a vehicle that has never had to hurry because it has never had to compete. Silas himself was up on the bench. He was a man in his mid-50s, the kind of man who had been handsome enough once that his face still carried the architecture of it, even now that the flesh had settled into something heavier and more certain of itself. He pulled his horses to a stop. He looked at Mara. He looked at the crates. He looked at Dottie's wagon, which was borrowed, which he knew was borrowed, which everyone in Red Hollow knew Mara couldn't afford her own. He laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. That was almost worse. It was a private laugh, the kind you make when something confirms what you already believed. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "don't tell me you're hauling that garbage." Mara kept loading. "Good evening, Silas. That fruit is done. You understand that? It's bruised through. It'll mold before the week's out. Thank you for the agricultural advice." "I'm serious." He leaned an elbow on his knee. He was comfortable up there, the way men are comfortable when they are used to looking down at things. "I don't know what you think you're going to do with crates of ruined peaches, but whatever it is, it's not going to work. You'd be better off using that money for your rent, which I hear is due." He said that last part carefully, the way you say something you want to land without appearing to throw it. Mara straightened up and looked at him. "Dottie," she said without breaking Silas's gaze, "can you grab that last crate on the left?" Dottie grabbed the crate. Silas held Mara's look for a moment, then made a sound through his nose, dismissive, final, and clicked his horses forward. Mara watched his wagon go. Her heart was going harder than she wanted it to. She could feel it in her throat, in her wrists. She was not unafraid. She was not some figure of iron who felt nothing when a man with that much power laughed at her in the road. But there was something underneath the fear that was harder than the fear, and she pressed her hand against it to make sure it was still there. It was. The kitchen that night was hot and smelled of bruised peaches and the particular sweetness that comes when fruit starts breaking down, when it stops being what it was and begins becoming something else. Mara worked from the recipe her mother had written on that church bulletin. She had read it so many times in the years since her mother died that she almost had it memorized, but she kept the paper on the counter anyway because it felt important to have it there. Her mother's handwriting was cramped and practical, the handwriting of a woman who wrote things down to use them, not to be admired. The method was unusual. Most preserving recipes started with whole or near-whole fruit. Her mother's recipe started with the damage. You sorted the peaches not to set aside the bruised ones, but to understand the bruising. Deep bruise, surface bruise, split at the stem, split at the seam. Each kind of damage was handled differently, cooked for different times, broken down to different textures. The spices her mother had used were not subtle: cardamom, black pepper, a single dried red pepper per 6-quart batch for heat that you felt 3 seconds after the sweetness. And something else, a small addition her mother had written in a different ink, as if she'd added it later: 1 tablespoon of good apple cider vinegar per batch. Trust me. Mara trusted her. The first batch she made that night was not perfect. The texture was slightly too loose. She'd rushed the breaking down stage, too eager, too anxious, wanting it done so she could know if it worked. She set it aside and started the second batch. And this time she made herself slow down, made herself pay attention the way her mother's recipe demanded attention. And around midnight, when she ladled the second batch into the first of her clean jars and held it up to the lamp, she felt something shift in her chest. It was golden red, the color of late afternoon, the color of the orchard before the storm. The smell, even through the glass, was remarkable, sweet and warm and complicated, with that faint vinegar lift underneath that made your nose want to come back and check again. She tasted it. She sat down. She tasted it again. Her mother had been right. The damage, the bruising, the split skins, the overripeness the storm had forced on the fruit before its time hadn't ruined it. It had done something to the sugar, concentrated it, and complicated it, and the spices had caught that complexity and run with it. It was not a simple preserve. It was not the kind of thing you put on plain toast without noticing. It was the kind of thing that made you stop chewing and look up. Mara sat in her hot kitchen at midnight, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that something here was real. Then she heard a sound from the porch. She went still. She wasn't afraid of much, but she was alone, and it was midnight, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and Silas Mercer had driven away from her on that road looking the way men look when they've decided to let you fail on your own instead of helping it along. She took the iron ladle off the stove. She went to the door. She opened it. On the porch step, curled against the post with his thin jacket pulled around him, was a boy. I was maybe 11 or 12, small for whatever age he was, with dark circles under his eyes, and the specific stillness of someone who has learned that being invisible is safer than being noticed. He was not asleep. He looked up at her when the door opened, and his face did not change. No surprise, no pleading, just a flat, careful watchfulness. "I'm not stealing anything," he said. His voice was hoarse. "I was just cold." Mara looked at him for a long moment. What's your name? A pause. Noah. Noah what? Another pause. Longer. Briggs? I think. I think. Mara knew what that meant. She had met children before who weren't certain of their own last names, children who had been moved around enough times that the facts of their own lives had become approximate. Are you hungry, Noah Briggs? He looked at her with the particular expression of a child who has been tricked before by questions that seemed kind. Maybe, he said. Mara stepped back from the door. Come in out of the cold, she said. I'm making something and I need a second opinion. He didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, like an animal making a decision it hasn't fully committed to yet, he stood up and followed her inside. She gave him a biscuit left from supper and a bowl of the first batch of preserves, the one she'd set aside for being too loose. He ate the biscuit in 3 bites. He put a spoonful of the preserves in his mouth. He went completely still. It was not the stillness of politeness. It was the stillness of someone who has been surprised by something they didn't expect to feel. That's... He stopped. Too sweet? Not sweet enough? No, it's... He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. That's the best thing I've ever had. Mara looked at the jar. She looked at the 12 others lined up on the counter. The second batch is better, she said. She sat down across from him. Outside the window, the storm-washed Colorado sky was full of stars. The kitchen was warm. The jars on the counter caught the lamplight and held it, small fires in a row. Do you have somewhere to be? She asked. He considered the question the way children consider questions that have wrong answers hidden in them. No, he said finally. Not really. Mara nodded slowly. All right, she said. Then here's what I need you to know. Tomorrow morning, I'm going back for the rest of those peaches on the Gaines lot, and I'm going to make as many jars of this as I can before my supply runs out. Then I'm going to take them to the Saturday market, and I'm going to sell every one of them. She paused. I don't know if it'll work. I want to be straight with you about that. It might not work. But you think it will, Noah said. She looked at him. Yeah, she said. I think it will. He scraped the last of the preserve from the bowl with the back of the biscuit. He chewed. He thought about something for a while, with the focused gravity of a child making a real calculation. I can help, he said. I'm not lazy. I know how to work. I know, she said. Though she didn't, not yet. But she said it because it was the thing that needed to be said. Noah Briggs finished his biscuit and looked at the 12 jars on the counter and said nothing more. And Mara Ellison turned back to her stove and began the third batch. And outside the window, the frontier night settled in around the small, warm square of light from her kitchen like it was something worth keeping. She had $3. She had a recipe. She had a boy who'd appeared from nowhere on her porch and tasted something and gone still. She had maybe the beginning of something. That was enough to keep going. Part 2. Turning Ruin into Gold. The Saturday market in Red Hollow opened at 7 in the morning, and by 6:45, Mara had already been standing behind her table for 20 minutes. She had 11 jars. That was it. 11 jars from 4 days of work, 4 days of waking before dawn and going to bed after midnight, 4 days of standing over a stove in a kitchen that stayed hot even with the windows open, 4 days of learning her mother's recipe the way you learn a language. Not by reading about it, but by making mistakes in it until the mistakes stopped. Noah had helped her carry the crates to Dottie's borrowed wagon that morning without being asked. He'd been sleeping on the floor of the farmhouse since the night he appeared on the porch, wrapped in the old quilt Mara kept in the trunk at the foot of the bed. She hadn't officially said he could stay. He hadn't officially asked. They had both simply proceeded as if the arrangement had already been decided somewhere above their heads, and they were just catching up to it. He stood beside her now, behind the table, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the market fill up with people the way he watched most things, quietly, taking in more than he let on. The table next to Mara's belonged to June Platt, who sold dried herbs and medicinal teas and had been doing so at this market for 15 years. June was a small, narrow woman with an opinion about everything and the social confidence to share it freely. She looked at Mara's 11 jars, and she looked at the small hand-lettered sign Mara had made the night before. Silver Orchard Preserves, handcrafted, small batch. And she pressed her lips together in the particular way that meant she was choosing not to say something. How much are you charging? June asked. $1.25 a jar. June's eyebrows went up. For preserves. For these preserves, Mara said. June looked at the jars again. They were plain glass, clean but not fancy, sealed with wax and tied with a strip of cotton cloth because Mara didn't have ribbon. They were not beautiful objects, but the color of the preserve inside them was that deep amber red, lit from behind by the morning sun coming in at an angle off the mountains. It looked like something you'd find in a jeweler's window, not on a market table. You'll sell 2, June said. Maybe 3. People around here aren't going to pay $1.25 for peach jam. It's not peach jam, Noah said very quietly from beside Mara. June looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was not rude but was completely unmoved. He's right, Mara said. It's not jam. She didn't explain further. She'd decided the night before that she wasn't going to explain it. Either the jars would speak for themselves or they wouldn't, and if they wouldn't, then she needed to know that now rather than after she'd made 300 more of them. The first 2 hours were bad. People stopped. They picked up the jars, turned them, looked at the price, set them back down. A few of them asked questions with the tone of people who have already decided the answer. One man in a good coat, she didn't know him, he wasn't from Red Hollow, probably passing through from one of the ranches further east, picked up a jar, read the label, and put it back with the careful deliberateness of someone returning an object to its correct position in a museum. Noah watched all of this without expression. Once, between customers, he looked up at Mara and said, "Do you want to lower the price?" "No," she said. He nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected and approved of. Around 9:30, a woman named Clara Hoyt stopped at the table. Clara was in her 60s and had driven in from the Hoyt Ranch, 12 miles out, and she was the kind of woman who moved through a market the way experienced buyers move, deliberately, not stopping at things that didn't earn it. She picked up one of Mara's jars. She didn't look at the price first, she looked at the contents. "Open it," she said. Mara hesitated. She only had 11, then took the jar, broke the wax seal with her thumbnail, and opened it. Clara dipped in the small tasting spoon Mara had brought and put it in her mouth. The market noise continued around them. Someone was arguing about the price of oats 2 tables down. A dog was barking at something near the feed stall. Normal Saturday sounds. Clara stood completely still. Then she looked at Mara. "Where did you learn to make this?" "My mother," Mara said. "Is she here? I'd like to tell her something." "She passed 8 years ago." Clara looked at the jar, then back at Mara. "I'm buying 4, she said. "I only have 10 left, Mara said. The open jar wouldn't keep as long now. "I know. I want 4 of the 10. Clara set her 4 jars to one side with a proprietary firmness that made it clear they were no longer available to other customers. "I'm going to tell you something, and I'm telling you because I've been buying food at this market for 30 years, and I know the difference between something that's good and something that's actually worth talking about." She paused. "This is worth talking about. You need more jars." "I know," Mara said. "How much more fruit do you have?" "I'm working with damaged stock from the Gaines lot. Whatever's left after the storm." Clara frowned. "That won't last you. Have you talked to the Harmon boys? Their east side trees weren't hit as hard. They've got second-grade fruit. Not damaged exactly, just smaller, spotted. They were going to let it drop." Mara had not talked to the Harmon boys. She hadn't thought of the Harmon boys. "They'd sell it cheap," Clara said, "especially right now when everyone's trying to make back what the storm took." Clara paid for her 4 jars, picked them up like they were already heirlooms, and moved on through the market. By 11 o'clock, all 11 jars were gone. Mara stood behind the empty table and looked at the space where they had been. Noah stood next to her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. $14.37, Noah said. He had been keeping count. "Minus what I spent on supplies," Mara said. Still, she agreed. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about the Harmon boys. She thought about how many jars she could make if she had more fruit, better fruit, a more consistent supply. She thought about what Clara Hoyt had said. This is worth talking about. And something in her chest tightened with a feeling that wasn't quite hope yet, but was the shape of hope, the outline of it, waiting to be filled in. "Come on," she said to Noah. "We've got work to do." The Harmon brothers, Cade and younger Dell, were not difficult men, but they were cautious the way people are cautious when they've been burned enough times to make caution a habit. They had inherited their farm from their father, and they ran it together with the particular efficiency of two people who have never really agreed on anything, but have learned to work around each other's disagreements. Mara went to see them the following Monday morning with Noah at her side, which she'd done intentionally because she'd noticed that Noah's presence made certain men behave better. They'd talk to him, ask him questions, relax in a way they didn't with a woman alone. She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed by this or to use it. She'd decided to use it. Cade Harmon was in the yard when they arrived, repairing a fence with a focus that suggested he was glad to have something to do with his hands. He straightened up when he saw the wagon. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. He nodded at Noah. "Boy." "Cade," Mara said, "I heard you've got second-grade fruit on your east side. I want to make you an offer." He crossed his arms. "What kind of offer?" "Cash for the lot. Whatever's too small or spotted for standard market. I'll take it off your hands and save you the hauling costs to the cannery. Silas Mercer buys my second grade. Silas Mercer pays you 9 cents a pound and sells it to Denver for 22. Cade said nothing. His jaw shifted. "I'm offering 11, Mara said, "and I'll come pick it up myself. You don't have to bring it anywhere." "What do you want it for?" "Same thing I've been making. Preserves." Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Noah, the way people sometimes look at a third party when they want a second opinion without admitting they want one. "You her boy?" he asked. "Yes," Noah said, simply, without blinking. Mara didn't correct him. Cade looked back at his fence. He was quiet for long enough that a crow landed on the post beside him and he didn't notice it. 11 cents, he said. 11 cents. And you'll come pick it up. I'll come pick it up. He pulled on his work gloves. Come back Thursday. Dell will have it sorted. Dell Harmon, it turned out, was the one who'd actually heard about Mara's preserves from his wife, who'd been at the Saturday market and seen the jars sell out. He met them at the East Side Trees on Thursday with a kind of suppressed excitement he was clearly trying not to show because he didn't know yet if it would embarrass him. My wife said Clara Hoyt bought 4 jars, Dell said, helping load the first crate onto the wagon. She did, Mara said. Clara Hoyt doesn't buy 4 of anything unless she's sending some away. I know. Where's she sending them? I didn't ask, Mara said, but I appreciated the business. Dell scratched the back of his neck. He was younger than Cade by 7 or 8 years, and he had the energy of a man who liked things to be moving, liked things to be happening. You think there's real demand? Or is this one of those things that's exciting for a week, and then... He trailed off. I don't know yet, Mara said. I think there's real demand, but I've been wrong before. He seemed to appreciate the honesty of that more than he would have appreciated a confident answer. He helped them load the rest of the crates without charging extra for his labor, which she suspected was his way of making a small investment in something he wasn't sure about yet. The farmhouse kitchen became something different in those weeks. It had always been a working kitchen, functional, plain, the kind of room that existed to do a job and not to be admired. But now it had a rhythm to it, a schedule, a sense of purpose that changed the air inside it, the way a fire changes the air in a room, warmer, more charged, more alive. Mara worked the morning shift and the evening shift, with a break in the afternoon when the heat of the stove in a warm autumn afternoon was genuinely punishing. Noah worked whenever she worked, and he had turned out to be exactly what he'd said on the porch that first night, not lazy. He didn't need to be shown things twice. He had the particular gift of being able to hold a complicated sequence of steps in his head without writing them down, and he'd memorized the recipe within the first week, not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd simply been paying attention. She'd taught him the sorting method first, how to assess each piece of fruit for its type of damage and organize the batches accordingly. He'd listened with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that the seriousness was warranted. Why does it matter? He asked, the first time. Damaged is damaged. No, she said. A split at the stem means the fruit started to ferment a little before it fell. That changes the sugar. A deep bruise means the flesh has broken down in a specific way that affects texture. You cook those differently, or you get different results, and the results have to be consistent, or you can't call it the same product twice. He thought about that. So the damage isn't random. Nothing's random, she said. It just looks that way until you understand what you're looking at. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, is that true about other things too? She'd looked at him across the crate of peaches between them. Yeah, she said, usually. He'd gone back to sorting. She'd watched him for a moment. This boy who had appeared from nowhere with his careful eyes and his too-thin jacket and his I think when she asked his last name. And she'd felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not maternal, exactly. Something more practical than that. Something like recognition. By the third week, they had fallen into a routine so natural, it felt like it had been happening for years. Noah handled the morning sorting while Mara prepared the jars and calculated batches. She cooked while he labeled. He cleaned while she did the accounting, which was still simple enough to do in a small notebook with a stubby pencil, but was no longer as simple as it had been the first week. The second Saturday market sold out in 90 minutes. The third Saturday, a man from Glenwood came specifically because his wife's cousin had brought a jar back from Red Hollow, and he'd been sent to buy 4 more. He looked slightly embarrassed about this mission, the way men are embarrassed when the errand reveals that they are doing something entirely for the pleasure of someone they love. 4 jars, he said, pulling out his money. I can only let you have 3, Mara said. I'm keeping 1 aside. Why? Because Clara Hoyt asked for it, and she was my first real customer, and I don't forget things like that. The man from Glenwood blinked. Then he paid for 3 jars and left. And Mara had the distinct sense that the story of the woman who kept aside a jar for her first customer would travel back to Glenwood with him, and might be worth more in the long run than the extra jar would have been. Noah, who had been watching this, said nothing. But when the man left, he glanced at Mara with an expression that was the closest thing to approval she'd seen on his face. It was Dottie who first said the word that Mara hadn't let herself say yet. She came over on a Wednesday evening in the 4th week, when the kitchen smelled the way it always smelled now, warm and spiced in particular, a smell that had begun to feel less like the smell of cooking and more like the smell of the place itself. And she sat at the table and watched Mara pour a finished batch into jars. You're running a business, Dottie said. I'm making preserves, Mara said. Mara. She looked up. You've sold 43 jars in 3 weeks. You've got standing orders from 2 families in Glenwood, a repeat buyer from the Hoyt Ranch, and that couple from Carbondale who came back last Saturday. You've paid your rent. Dottie let that last one land. You have paid your rent, 2 weeks early. Mara set down the ladle. She had not said it to herself because she'd been afraid that saying it would jinx it, or invite someone to take it away, or make her see clearly how fragile it all still was. But Dottie was saying it for her, and Dottie had 62 years of watching things in this valley succeed and fail, and she didn't use words carelessly. You're running a business, Dottie said again, which means you need to start thinking like a business. What does that mean? It means you need more jars. Not 12 at a time from the general store, real stock, wholesale. It means you need to think about what happens when the Harmon lot runs out. It means... She stopped. It means Silas Mercer is going to notice. The kitchen went quiet except for the soft percussion of the preserve cooling in its jars. He already noticed, Mara said. Has he said anything? Not yet. He won't say anything yet, Dottie said. That's not how he works. He watches first. Lets you feel safe. Then, I know how he works. Dottie looked at her. Do you? Because there's knowing how he works and there's being prepared for how he works, and those are not the same thing. Mara leaned against the counter. She looked at the row of filled jars. She thought about Silas on his big wagon, laughing that private laugh. What do you think he'll do? Noah asked. Both women looked at him. He was sitting in the chair by the window, the one he'd claimed without ceremony sometime in the 2nd week, cross-legged, the account notebook open on his knee. He'd been doing the calculations she asked him to do, and he looked up from them without apology. I think you'll wait until you need something, Dottie said. Suppliers, transport, storage, credit. He has his hands in all of it. When you reach for something you need, he'll be there first. Then we reach before he can, Noah said. Dottie looked at him. He's right, Mara said. We stop using anyone Silas controls. We go around him from the start, before he knows we're doing it. You'll need more farmers, Dottie said. People who'll sell direct to you and not through his network. I need to know who's already frustrated with him, who he's underpaid, who he's shorted on weight, who he's made wait past their bills while he collected early. She paused. You know these people. Dottie was quiet for a moment. I know some of them. That's enough to start. Word travels in a small valley, the way water travels, finding the low places, moving around the obstacles, eventually reaching everywhere. By the 5th week, people were coming to Mara's farmhouse directly. Not just customers, though there were those too, driving up the road and knocking and being slightly surprised when they saw how modest the operation was. How much of it was one woman and a boy in a plain kitchen with a good stove. People came to ask about the preserves. People came to tell her they'd heard about them from someone who'd heard from someone else. A woman named Vera Stills came from 20 miles west, and she was not a customer, she was a buyer. She ran a small dry goods store in Ridgecrest, and she had heard about the Silver Orchard preserves from 3 different people in the past 2 weeks, and she had driven herself out to Red Hollow to see what the talking was about. She was a businesswoman, and she looked at Mara's operation the way a businesswoman looks at things. Not with sentimentality, not with the casual interest of a customer, but with the assessing eye of someone calculating whether there was something here worth attaching herself to. She tasted a jar. She set down the spoon. I want to stock these, she said. How many? Mara asked. Depends on how many you can reliably produce. Right now, about 30 to 35 a week. That's not enough for a wholesale arrangement. I know, Mara said. I'm working on supply. What's your timeline? I don't have one yet, Mara said, because I'm not going to promise you a timeline and then miss it. When I can reliably produce 60 jars a week, I'll come back to you. Vera Stills looked at her for a long moment. It was the look of someone recalibrating. All right, she said. You come back to me. After she left, Noah looked up from the counter where he'd been listening without appearing to listen. 60 a week, he said. I know, Mara said. That's more than we've ever done. I know. So what are we missing? It's not the recipe, it's not the method, it's supply and time. Supply and time, she agreed. If we had 2 more farmers selling direct to us, 3, she said, and someone to help with the cooking. Noah thought. What about Mrs. Plum? Dottie's daughter-in-law? The one in the second house over? Mara blinked. She had not thought of Ruthie Plum, and she should have. Ruthie was a good cook. She had 4 kids and a husband who worked irregular hours at the mill. And she had mentioned to Dottie twice in the past month that she was looking for something she could do from home. That's a good idea, Mara said. Noah went back to the notebook. I thought so. Ruthie Plum came over the following day, and she was at the stove inside 40 minutes, and she was good. Not as instinctive as Mara, but careful and consistent and able to follow the recipe with a precision that was actually an advantage in certain stages of the process that required exact timing. By the end of the week, she was coming every morning for 4 hours, and Mara was paying her from the week's earnings, and the production numbers started to climb. It was during this period that Mara made her first real mistake. She'd been approached at the market by a man named Tolliver, who said he worked logistics for a regional freight company and had heard about the Silver Orchard operation and wanted to discuss transportation contracts for getting product to buyers in Denver. It was exactly what she needed. She'd been thinking for weeks about how to reach the Denver market, which was where the real money was, the hotels and restaurants that paid premium prices for artisan goods. And Tolliver was smooth and professional and spoke the right language. She sat down with him on a Thursday afternoon and talked for an hour, and she almost said yes. It was Noah who stopped her. He'd been in the corner of the room during the meeting, doing something with the account books, barely audible. After Tolliver left, he looked up and said, That freight company is Silas Mercer's. Mara went still. How do you know that? I looked at the name when he put his card on the table. Ridgeline Freight. I've seen that name on the side of the wagons that go in and out of Silas's warehouse yard. He paused. I wasn't certain, so I didn't say anything while he was here. But I walked over to Del Harmon's before supper and I asked Del. He confirmed it. Mara sat down. The full weight of how close she'd come settled on her slowly, the way cold settles in. Gradually, then completely. She had almost handed Silas Mercer the keys to her distribution. She had almost solved her logistics problem in a way that would have given him the ability to delay her shipments, damage her product, raise her rates, or simply stop her from reaching Denver whenever he chose. He's not watching anymore, she said. No, Noah said. He's not. She looked at the boy across the room. He was 12 years old, or maybe 11. and he had just saved her business with a name he read upside down off a card on a table while appearing to be entirely absorbed in something else. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. It was a careful, practiced shrug, the kind that means you don't have to thank me, but also means I will remember that you did. She found her own way into Denver. It took 2 more weeks and the help of Vera Stills, who turned out to know a woman named Agnes Ford, who worked as a purchasing manager for the Clarendon Hotel, one of Denver's finer establishments. Agnes Ford came out to Red Hollow on a Thursday in early October, drove the distance herself, and sat at Mara's kitchen table and ate 3 different jars with a systematic thoroughness that was more like analysis than eating. She asked questions about the process. She asked about consistency. She asked about what happened when the peach season ended, whether Mara had considered other fruits, other produce, whether the method was transferable. "The method works on any fruit that's been stressed," Mara said. "Damaged apple, underripe pear that's been sitting, bruised plum. The principle is the same. You work with what the damage has done instead of trying to pretend it didn't happen." Agnes Ford looked at her. "We have 12 properties across Colorado," she said. "If you can reach 100 jars per week by spring, I'd like to talk about a supply contract." Mara kept her face very still. "I think that's achievable," she said. Agnes left. Mara sat at the table for a long time. Ruthie was in the kitchen still, cleaning up the afternoon's work. Noah was doing the week's numbers. Outside, the October evening was coming down over the mountains, and the peach trees on the Harmon lot's east side were going bare, the season ending, the harvest taken, the branches returning to their essential shapes. 100 jars a week. 12 properties. She thought about the $3 on the kitchen table, 5 weeks ago. She thought about Silas Mercer laughing on the road. She thought about her mother's handwriting on the back of a church bulletin, those cramped, practical letters. 1 tablespoon of good apple cider vinegar per batch. Trust me. She thought about damaged things and what they became when someone paid attention. "Noah," she said. He looked up. "I need you to figure out how many farmers we'd need to supply 100 jars a week." He turned back to the notebook. His pencil moved for about 30 seconds. "At current yield per pound, and accounting for waste and sorting," he looked up. 4, maybe 5, depending on what they're growing." "All right," she said. "Make a list. People Silas hasn't locked up yet." He was already writing. Ruthie Plum, from across the kitchen, dried her hands on her apron and said quietly, "I know a woman. My second cousin's husband. He's got a good-sized lot over toward Marble Creek. Silas lowballed him last season, and he hasn't forgotten it." "Put him on the list," Mara said. The list grew. It would keep growing. And somewhere across the valley, in a warehouse that smelled of crated fruit and ambition, Silas Mercer was watching the numbers. The market reports, the freight logs, the whispers that move through small towns the way whispers do, finding his ears, the way everything found its way to his ears eventually. He was watching. He was calculating. And Mara Ellison, with her borrowed wagon and her mother's recipe and the boy who read names upside down on cards, had just made herself impossible to ignore. Part 3. The Powerful Strike. Back. The list Noah made that October evening had 7 names on it by the time he finished, and Mara spent the following week visiting each one. She went alone, without Noah, because some of these conversations needed to happen between adults, and she'd learned that certain farmers talked more honestly when they weren't being watched by a child who was clearly keeping score. The visits went the way conversations go when people have been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Holt Gentry over at Marble Creek, Ruthie's second cousin's husband, met her at his fence line with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and inside 10 minutes he was nodding with the contained energy of a man who had been angry for a long time and was relieved to have somewhere to put it. Silas Mercer had shorted Holt's weight on 3 separate deliveries the previous season, and when Holt raised it with the freight office, he'd been told the discrepancy was within normal variance. He'd known it wasn't. He'd known and had nowhere to take the knowing. 11 cents a pound, Mara said. Same as the Harmon brothers. I pick up, you don't haul. What happens if you can't take everything I've got? Then I'll tell you that before harvest, not after. You'll have time to make other arrangements. He looked at her for a long moment, the way people look when they're trying to find the catch. Silas is going to know, he said. Yes, she said. He is. And you're not worried about that. She thought about Tolliver and the Ridgeline freight card and how close she'd come to handing Silas a door into everything she was building. "I'm very worried about it," she said, "but I'm more worried about what happens if I let that worry make my decisions." Holt signed on. So did 4 of the other 6 names on the list. By the end of the week, Mara had enough committed supply to realistically reach the 100-jar target Agnes Ford had named. She went home and told Noah and Ruthie made coffee, and they sat around the kitchen table, and there was a brief, warm moment of something that felt like arrival, like they had climbed something and could see from the top of it. The moment lasted about 4 days. It started with the jars. Mara had been ordering her glass jars from Whitmore's, the general store in Red Hollow, which ordered them in from a supplier in Colorado Springs. She'd been doing this for 6 weeks without trouble. When she sent Noah to pick up the latest order the second week of October, he came back with an empty wagon and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Careful, tight, like he was containing something. "Mr. Whitmore says his supplier won't fill orders under 50 units anymore," Noah said. "That's not what they told me last month." "I know. He said the policy changed." Mara looked at him. He looked back at her. "Did he say when it changed?" she asked. "He said recently." Noah paused. "He wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it." She drove to Whitmore's herself that afternoon. Edwin Whitmore was a man she had known for 6 years. Not a friend exactly, but a reliable figure of commerce, someone she'd bought flour and candles and lamp oil from without drama. He was standing behind his counter when she came in, and he had the look of a man who was hoping the person walking through the door was anyone other than the person who had just walked through the door. "Edwin," she said, "tell me what happened with the jar supplier." He straightened his apron. "Policy change, nothing personal." "Edwin." "Mara, I'm sorry, I can't." He stopped. He looked down at the counter. "Someone came to see me. I'm not saying who." "You don't need to," she said. He raised his eyes. They were miserable. Edwin Whitmore was not a bad man. He was a man caught between forces and choosing the one he'd always deferred to because the cost of the other choice felt too high. "I have suppliers in Grand Junction," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'll order from them directly. But, Edwin, you know what this is, and you're going to have to live with knowing." She left before he could respond. She didn't want to watch him justify it to himself. The Grand Junction supplier cost her 11% more per unit, and the freight added another 7%. It wasn't ruinous, but it was a cut, and cuts had a way of adding up when someone was making them systematically, which was, she understood now, exactly the point. Silas Mercer did not come to her directly. That would have been too simple, and simplicity was not how he'd built what he'd built. Instead, he worked through the system he'd spent 20 years assembling, tightening screws she didn't always know were there until they were already turned. The week after the jar situation, she heard from Cade Harmon that there'd been a buyer through the valley offering premium prices for second-grade fruit, prices high enough that it didn't make sense, higher than the cannery paid, higher than anything Mara could match. The buyer had come to 3 farms and made the same offer at each one. He hadn't given a company name. He'd paid in cash. Cade told her because he hadn't taken the offer, but his neighbor on the south side had. "He came to you?" Mara said. "Stopped at the road," Cade said. "Knew my name. Knew exactly what I had on the east side trees, which I hadn't told anyone except you and Dell." The silence that followed said everything that needed saying. "I didn't take it," Cade said. "I want to be clear about that. But I wanted you to know." "How many farms did he hit?" "That I know of? 3, maybe more." She drove to Dell's that evening. Dell was standing in his yard with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something he'd suspected and had been hoping not to confirm. "He came here too," Dell said before she could ask. "Did you?" "No." Sharp, immediate. "No." "But Mara, he was offering 20 cents a pound. 20. That's almost double what you pay me." She stood with that number for a moment. 20 cents was not a buying price. It was a burning price. Silas Mercer wasn't trying to corner her fruit supply because he needed it. I was trying to corner it to make sure she couldn't have it, and he was willing to pay twice the market rate to do it, because the cost of removing her was, to him, less than the cost of watching her keep growing. "I can't match 20 cents, she said. "I know," Dell said. "I won't insult you by trying." He looked at his trees. They were bare now, the season done, just the architecture of branches against the October sky. He was quiet for a long time. He didn't buy my fruit, he said finally. But he bought Peterson's lot and the Arroyo Creek boys. That's a significant chunk of what you were counting on for next season. She did the math in her head. It was painful math. With the Arroyo Creek loss and Peterson's lot gone, her spring supply projections dropped by nearly a third. 100 jars a week became 70 at best, and 70 wasn't the number Agnes Ford had named. She drove home in the dark and sat at the table and did not let herself panic, which took considerable effort because the panic was right there, waiting, with reasonable arguments. Noah came in from wherever he'd been. He had a habit of disappearing in the evenings for an hour and coming back having clearly been thinking very hard about something. And he sat across from her and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. The jar supplier, the mystery buyer, the Arroyo Creek loss, the numbers. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she'd come to depend on. He listened the whole way through before he said anything, and he never said the first thing that came into his head. "He's trying to squeeze from two directions," Noah said when she finished. "Supply and materials. I wants to make it so you can't fill your orders so Agnes Ford drops you, so you look unreliable." "Yes." "But he hasn't touched the Harmon brothers." "Not yet." "Or Holt Gentry." "Not yet," she said again. Noah thought, what if we got out in front of it? What if we went to every farmer on our list and we offered contracts, not verbal agreements, actual written contracts, fixed prices, fixed volume commitments for the full season. So there's something on paper. She looked at him. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "No, but Dottie's son-in-law is." She blinked. She had forgotten that. Robert Plum, Ruthie's husband, who worked irregular hours at the mill. Before the mill, he'd done 2 years of legal study in Denver before something had happened that nobody talked about directly, and he'd come back to Red Hollow. He wasn't a practicing attorney, but he knew how paper worked. "It might hold," Noah said, "even if it doesn't hold in court. And it might. It gives the farmers something to point to, something that makes it harder to just shake a man's hand and walk away." It was, she thought, a better idea than anything she'd come up with sitting at this table for the past hour. "I'll talk to Robert tomorrow," she said. She talked to Robert Plum the next morning in the kitchen while Ruthie worked the stove and pretended not to listen with the particular transparent inattentiveness of someone who is absolutely listening. Robert was a compact, careful man with ink-stained fingers and the habit of clicking his thumbnail against his front teeth when he was thinking. He looked at what she needed. He asked questions. He clicked his thumbnail. "It won't be an ironclad contract," he said, "not without a licensed attorney drawing it up. But it'll be a binding purchase agreement with enough specific language that if someone tries to get out of it for reasons unrelated to natural crop failure, you have grounds." "That's enough," Mara said. "You understand this costs you something. Farmers who sign a fixed-price contract with you can't take a better offer from someone else without consequence. Some of them won't want that." "The ones who won't want it are the ones who might take the better offer," Mara said. "So that's useful information." Robert looked at her for a moment. He clicked his thumbnail once more, then stopped. "Give me 3 days," he said. The contracts went out this following week. She presented them in person at each farm, sitting at kitchen tables and answering questions honestly, including the ones she didn't have good answers to. Holt Gentry signed without hesitation. Cade Harmon signed after reading it twice with the focused attention of a man who doesn't trust documents but trusts this particular woman enough to try. Del Harmon signed and then made coffee, and they sat for a while talking about the coming winter, which was ordinary and good. 2 farmers on the list declined. She thanked them, told them there were no hard feelings, and meant it, though it complicated her spring numbers. She was working on solving the spring numbers problem when the third thing happened, and the third thing was worse than the first 2. Henry Calloway came to the farmhouse on a Wednesday morning, and he did not come the way he usually came. Easy, unhurried, the way a landlord comes when everything is fine. He came with his hat in his hands, which was how men carried bad news in Red Hollow. "Mara," he said. He looked at the floor, then made himself look at her. "I've had a visit." She didn't ask from whom. "He knows about the debt on this place," Henry said. "The mortgage I took out in '89. He knows who holds it, and he's made arrangements to purchase it." He stopped. "Mara, I didn't know he could do that. I didn't know a man could just buy another man's debt like—" "He can," she said quietly. If the lender is willing. The lender was willing. She sat down. Not because her legs gave way, she was not a woman whose legs gave way, but because she needed a moment to let this settle, and she thought better sitting. Silas Mercer now held the debt on the farm she rented, which meant that if Henry Calloway defaulted, or if Silas engineered a situation where Henry appeared to default, Silas had grounds to move on the property. And if he moved on the property, Mara's kitchen, her stove, her workspace, her operation, everything she had built in these weeks, was gone. Henry was talking, apologizing, explaining, and she heard him but couldn't quite focus on the specific words because she was thinking hard. "How much is the remaining debt?" she asked, cutting him off gently. She didn't have $240. She had the revenue from the past 6 weeks, minus expenses, minus Ruthie's wages, minus the elevated jar costs from Grand Junction, minus the contract payments to the farmers. What she had was a business that was working, but was not yet working at the scale where it had reserves. "How long before he can move on it?" she asked. "He needs a default. Right now, Henry's current on his payments. He told me—" Henry stopped. "He said he'd give you 30 days to vacate voluntarily." "He told you to tell me that?" "Yes." She looked at Henry Calloway, this man who was not her enemy, who was embarrassed and scared, who had gotten caught in the middle of something larger than him. She did not blame him. She also understood that he was going to do what he had to do, and that what he had to do was not going to be what she needed. "Thank you for telling me in person," she said. He left with his hat still in his hands. The kitchen was empty. Ruthie had gone home for the midday. Noah was somewhere on the property. Mara sat alone at the table with the account notebook and a pencil, and she wrote down the number 240 at the top of a blank page. She stared at it. Then she wrote under it, "What is this actually?" It was a threat. It was a pressure point. It was Silas Mercer's hand closing around the thing she needed most and squeezing to see if she'd let go of everything else to get it back. She thought about letting go. She was honest enough with herself to think about it, to consider what it would mean to go to Silas Mercer and say she was done, she was selling the operation, she was walking away. He'd pay her something for it, probably. Some small amount that would feel significant to a woman who'd started with $3 and would feel like a rounding error to him. She could walk away. She could take whatever he offered and pay her rent somewhere else and go back to the life she'd had before the storm. Noah appeared in the doorway. He had mud on his boots and what appeared to be a smear of something reddish-brown on his jacket sleeve that she chose not to investigate. He looked at her face. "He's going after the farm," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He came in and pulled out his chair and sat down across from her, the same way he'd sat across from her on that first night, with the bowl of 2 loose preserves between them. He was slightly taller now than he'd been then. She'd noticed this 2 weeks ago and felt something complicated about it that she hadn't finished feeling yet. "What are we doing?" he said. "Not what are you doing, we." She pressed her hand flat on the page with the number on it. "We're not selling," she said. He nodded, once, like this confirmed something he'd already decided. "Then we need the 240, he said. "We need the 240. Agnes Ford's contract would cover it. Agnes Ford's contract requires 100 jars a week, and right now I'm at 65. 70, he said. I adjusted the numbers this morning. She looked at him. Holt's early spring crop will be better than I projected, he said. I rode out there yesterday and looked at the trees. The storm damage on his west block wasn't as deep as Cade thought. There's more viable fruit there than we counted. She sat with that. 70 wasn't 100, but 70 was better than 65. It's still not enough to sign Agnes's contract with confidence, she said. Not yet, he agreed, but we could sign it with honesty. We could tell her exactly where we are, what we're working to build, and what the obstacle is. And we could ask her if she'd consider a ramp-up arrangement, smaller volumes to start, scaling up by spring. Mara looked at him. You think she'd go for that? I think she came out here herself and drove 20 miles to taste our preserves, Noah said. I think a woman who does that is buying something more than jars of fruit. I think she's buying the person making them. And I think if you tell her the truth, she'll respect it more than a number you can't guarantee. The room was quiet for a moment. When did you get so smart? She said. He looked faintly embarrassed, which was the most childlike she'd seen him in weeks. I've been thinking about it, he said, about how he works. Silas. He expects people to hide when he pushes. He expects them to get smaller and quieter and hope he moves on. He paused. But what if you don't get smaller? She looked at the number on the page, $240. What if you get bigger instead, she said. Harder to squeeze something that's bigger than your hands, he said. She thought about the farmers who'd signed contracts. She thought about Vera Stills in Ridgecrest, who was still waiting for a supply she could stock. She thought about the 2 farmers who'd declined to sign, who might reconsider if the situation changed. She thought about Del Harmon's face when he said Silas had offered 20 cents a pound. Not greed on Del's face, something more complicated, the face of a man testing himself. We need more farmers, she said. Yes. Outside the valley, outside his reach. Marble Creek's a start, Noah said. Holt mentioned a man named Seaver, over past Glenwood. He grows late-season stone fruit. Silas hasn't penetrated that far west yet. You've been talking to Holt. I asked him some questions, Noah said, with the tone of someone who considers this obvious and not particularly remarkable. She almost smiled. She didn't quite. There was still $240 on the page and 30 days on the clock, and a man across the valley who had decades of experience dismantling things that people tried to build. But almost. She wrote to Agnes Ford that same evening. She wrote it 3 times, drafting and discarding, until she had something that was completely true without being desperate. She laid out the current production numbers, the supply constraints, the growth trajectory she could realistically project. She explained that external pressure was affecting her supplier network. She didn't name Silas, didn't need to. Agnes Ford was a businesswoman who knew how valleys worked, and that she was actively building supply routes outside the affected network. She proposed a ramp-up structure, 40 jars a week to start, scaling to 100 by late spring, with a price premium in the early months in exchange for the flexibility. She sent it with the freight wagon on Thursday. Agnes Ford replied the following Tuesday, which was fast enough to mean she'd been thinking about it before the letter arrived. She agreed to the ramp-up structure. She agreed to the price premium. And she added a single line at the end of her reply that Mara read 3 times standing at the door before she went inside. I've dealt with men like your problem before. They always underestimate how far someone will go when they have something worth protecting. Good luck, Mrs. Ellison. I don't think you'll need it. What happened next came from a direction Mara hadn't expected, the way the worst things usually do. She'd been so focused on the supply network, on the contracts, on Agnes Ford, on the Harmon brothers and Holt Gentry, and the logistics of getting around Silas Mercer's distribution tentacles. She'd been so focused on all of that she'd let herself forget the most direct leverage he had. She was not the only vulnerable person in her kitchen. The letter came addressed to Henry Calloway, but it was hand-delivered to Mara's door by a man she didn't recognize. Lean, forgettable, the kind of man you'd look past in a crowd. He handed her the envelope without a word and left before she could ask any questions. Inside was a legal notice. She couldn't follow all the language, but Robert Plum read it that afternoon, and his face went tight in a way she hadn't seen before. It's about Noah, Robert said. She went very still. Specifically, it's a notice to the county that an unregistered minor is residing at this address without documented guardianship. He set the paper down. In itself, that's not unusual. Plenty of children live in informal arrangements out here. But paired with a request to the county welfare officer to assess the situation, he stopped. He's trying to take Noah, Mara said. He's trying to destabilize you. Remove Noah, you lose your most capable assistant. You lose the person who's been managing your supply numbers and keeping your books. That's not why, Mara said. Robert looked at her. That's not why it matters, she said. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something that has been made steady by force. He's trying to take a child to get at me. He's using a child as a tool. She picked up the paper and looked at it. Noah Briggs came to me on a porch with nothing. He said, I think, when I asked his last name, I am not... She stopped, breathed. I am not letting anyone use him for anything. Not for me, not against me. He is not a piece in this. Robert was quiet. What do I need to do? She asked. Formal guardianship would protect him, Robert said. It's not a complicated filing, but it takes time, and you don't have a lot of time. How long does the county officer have before he has to respond to this notice? 15 days, under statute. And how long to file guardianship? If we do it right away, submit to the county seat in Glenwood. 10 days, maybe 12. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. "Do it," she said. She went and found Noah in the yard where he was stacking the empty crates from that morning's delivery. He looked up when she came around the corner, and he read her face the way he always read her face. Quickly, accurately, with the trained watchfulness of someone who has learned to catch weather before it arrives. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Directly, without softening it, because he was 12 years old and he had already survived things she probably didn't fully know about, and he deserved the truth in plain language. He listened. His face did what it did when he was processing something difficult. Went very still, the eyes focused somewhere slightly past her, working through it internally before he let any of it show. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to take me away from here," Noah said. "Yes." "To hurt you." "Yes." He looked down at the crate in his hands. He set it on the stack with careful precision. "Are you going to let him?" he asked. She looked at this boy who had appeared from nowhere on her porch and tasted something and said it was the best thing he'd ever had, and then asked if he could help. And she thought about how different her kitchen would be without him in it, and not just because of the numbers. "No," she said. "I'm going to file for guardianship, if you want that." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, through market days and late nights, and the Ridgeline freight card and the mystery buyer and all of it, his face did something unguarded, something that was not calculation or watchfulness, or the careful management of what he showed. "Yes," he said. "I want that." She nodded. She turned back toward the farmhouse. "Mara," he said. She turned back. He was still holding the next crate. He looked at it, then at her. "He thought he was using me to get to you," he said, "but he miscalculated." "How so?" "Because now you're not just fighting for a business." He set the crate on the stack. "Now you're fighting for a reason that doesn't have a price tag. And people who are fighting for something like that..." He stopped. He picked up the next crate. "They don't stop." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside, and she picked up the pen, and she started writing the letter that would begin the process of making Noah Briggs officially, legally, irrevocably hers to protect. Silas Mercer had spent 20 years learning how to dismantle things. He knew exactly how to find the cracks in what people built and press on them until they gave way. He knew supply chains and debt instruments and county law and the particular fear that lives in people who have too much to lose. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to learn, because it had never been relevant to the way he operated, was what happened when you tried to take something from a person who had already lost everything once and survived it. He was about to find out. Part 4. A community stands together. The guardianship filing went to the county seat in Glenwood on a Friday, carried by Robert Plum himself, who drove the distance in his own wagon and paid the filing fee out of his own pocket without telling Mara until afterward. When she found out, she tried to repay him, and he waved her off with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that something is not a transaction. "Don't," he said. "Just don't." She didn't push it. Some things you accept because refusing them costs the other person more than it costs you. The 15-day clock on the county welfare notice was running. Robert had filed on day 4, which meant they had a window, narrow but real. The county welfare officer, a man named Aldous Graft, who worked out of the Glenwood courthouse and covered 3 valleys including Red Hollow, would receive both the notice and the guardianship filing within days of each other. Robert's assessment was that Graft was a by-the-book man who wouldn't be inclined to act on Silas Mercer's notice while a legitimate guardianship petition was already in process. "He's cautious," Robert said. "Cautious is good for us right now." "Is Graft connected to Silas?" Mara asked. Robert thought about it. The honest, unhurried thinking of someone who actually knew the answer. Not directly. Silas has reach in this valley, but Glenwood is outside his usual territory. Graft won't know who filed the original notice. He'll just see 2 pieces of paper and take the path of least legal exposure. Which is to wait. Which is to wait, Robert confirmed. So they waited, and while they waited, everything else kept moving. The mortgage debt was the problem that didn't wait. $240 and 22 days left on the 30-day window Silas had delivered through Henry Calloway. Mara had run the numbers enough times that she could do them in her sleep, and the answer was always the same. At current production and current revenue, she would have $160 by the deadline. Maybe $170 if the week's market sold out fast. $70 short, possibly 80. She had not told anyone outside the farmhouse about the mortgage situation. She told Dottie because Dottie was the kind of person you told things to, and she'd told Robert because he needed to understand the full picture. She had not told the farmers she'd contracted with, had not told Ruthie, had not, and this was a deliberate decision she'd made and remade several times, told the customers who drove from Glenwood and Carbondale and Ridgecrest to buy her jars. Her reasoning was simple and probably wrong, and she knew it was probably wrong. She did not want to be saved by people's sympathy. She wanted to solve it herself, or as close to herself as she could manage. It was Dottie who made her see the problem with that reasoning. She came over on a Sunday evening, the 12th day of the 30-day window, and she brought a pot of bean soup because she'd made too much, which was Dottie's standard fiction for delivering food to people she was worried about. She set the pot on the stove and she sat down and she looked at Mara with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a 62-year-old woman who has watched enough proud people fail to know what pride costs. "You need to tell people," Dottie said. "I can manage Mara." Not loud, not harsh, just final, the way certain voices get when they've earned the right to be final. "You can't manage this one alone and you know it. The numbers don't work." "I'm $70 short, maybe more." "I know what you're short. Robert told me." She held up a hand before Mara could react to that. "Don't be angry at him. I asked, and he's not good at lying to me. Nobody is." Mara pressed her lips together. Outside the window, the November dark had come down early, the way it did at this elevation once the month turned, sudden and complete. "I built this myself," Mara said. "You built it with a boy who appeared on your porch, and a woman who comes every morning, and a neighbor who lends you her wagon, and a man who drove to Glenwood and paid a filing fee out of his own savings," Dottie said. "You have not built this alone. You just haven't been keeping honest count of the help." The room was quiet. "What do you want me to do?" Mara said. "Go around to people with my hat in my hands?" "I want you to tell the truth to the people whose lives have changed because of what you built here." Dottie leaned forward slightly. "Ruthie Plum has income for the first time in 3 years that doesn't depend on the mill schedule. Cade and Del Harmon are getting 11 cents a pound on fruit they were going to let rot. Holt Gentry finally has a buyer who doesn't short his weight. Clara Hoyt sends your preserves to her daughter in Denver every month now. These people have something they didn't have before you spent $3 on damaged peaches." She paused. "Let them decide what that's worth to them." Mara stared at the table. "I don't want them to feel obligated," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "That's not your decision to make for them," Dottie said. "That's the part you're getting wrong. You're so busy protecting your independence that you're making their choice for them before they get to make it. That's not strength, Mara. That's just a different kind of control." Mara looked up. It landed. She could feel it landing, the particular weight of a true thing. "I don't know how to ask," she said. "I know," Dottie said. "I'll help you." They started with the people Mara knew directly. Dottie suggested not a formal meeting, too much like a petition, too much like begging in a room, but individual conversations, person to person, honest and plain. Mara went to each one herself, without Noah, because she needed to do this part, and she needed to do it without a child watching her be vulnerable. She went to the Harmon brothers first. She sat at Cade's kitchen table, and she told them about the mortgage, about the timeline, about the $70. She told it without decoration. Cade listened with his arms on the table. When she finished, he looked at Del, and Del looked at him, and something passed between them that was years of brotherhood compressed into a glance. "How much do you need from us specifically?" Cade said. "I'm not asking you for a specific amount. I know you're not. I'm asking anyway." She gave him a number. Not the full gap. She'd divided it roughly by the number of people she planned to see, trying to distribute it in a way that didn't burden any one person too much. She told him that. Cade looked at the number. He looked at Del. Del nodded once. "We'll do 20, Cade said. "Between us." She opened her mouth. "Don't," Del said. "Don't tell us it's too much. We know what too much is." She closed her mouth. She went to Holt Gentry, who said yes before she finished the sentence and then apologized for not having more liquid. She went to Ruthie Plum, who teared up and then got embarrassed about tearing up, and then pressed $14 into Mara's hand and said it was 3 weeks of wages she'd been saving for something she couldn't name. "Ruthie, this is your money." "It's my money to do with what I want," Ruthie said, "and I want this." She went to Clara Hoyt, who drove herself into town specifically to meet Mara at Dottie's house, and who did not say very much but wrote out a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. Mara looked at it. "Clara, this is $40. "Yes," Clara said. "That's to Mrs. Ellison," Clara said, with the precise, cordial firmness of a woman who has managed a ranch for 30 years and is not accustomed to having her decisions questioned. "I sent your preserves to my daughter in Denver. My daughter served them at a dinner party. 3 of her guests asked where they came from. One of those guests is the wife of a hotel manager who has since contacted Agnes Ford about expanding a supply contract." She folded her hands. $40 is not charity. It is a return on an investment I made in October." Mara sat with that. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Make more preserves." By the 15th day of the 30-day window, Mara had $211, 29 short, and the people she'd already visited had given what they could. She sat with the number and turned it over and tried to find the angle she hadn't seen. It was Noah who found it, and he found it in the way he found most things, by paying attention to something everyone else had stopped noticing. He came in that afternoon from a walk he'd taken to the market square, which he did sometimes on days when the kitchen work was light, and he sat down and said, "You know who you haven't talked to?" "A lot of people," she said. "Edwin Whitmore." She looked up. "He didn't want to do what he did," Noah said. "You could see it on him. He's been buying from you at market every Saturday since, did you notice that? Every Saturday he comes and he buys a jar, 1 jar, like he's paying something back in small installments." She had noticed. She hadn't assigned meaning to it. "He's not one of ours," she said. "Not directly." "No. But he knows what Silas did to his own store by threatening the jar supplier through him. And a man who's been coming to market every Saturday to buy 1 jar from a woman he wronged." Noah paused. "He's been trying to find a way to do more. He just doesn't know if you want it." She thought about this for a long moment. She went to see Edwin Whitmore the next morning. He was behind his counter when she walked in, and his face went through several emotions in fast succession. Guilt, hope, more guilt. The trapped expression of a man who has been carrying something and doesn't know how to set it down. She didn't make him say anything first. She told him the situation, plain and complete. He was quiet when she finished. He looked at his counter. He looked at the door. He clicked open the drawer of his register and looked at what was inside. "I've got $31 in operating cash," he said. "I can give you 20 and make up the shortfall with this week's sales." "Edwin, I put your jar supplier out of your reach," he said. "I knew what I was doing and I did it anyway. I've got 140 Saturdays left before I retire, and if I spend every one of them buying a single jar, it still won't square it." He took out the bills. "Take the 20. Let me have this." She took the 20. The count was 231. $9 short with 6 days remaining, she told Dottie. Dottie said nothing for a moment, then reached into the pocket of her apron and put $9 on the table. "Dottie, it's my wagon," Dottie said. "I've been lending you my wagon for 3 months. Do you know what wagon rental costs in this valley? More than $9. She pushed it across. "Consider it back payment. $240. Mara looked at the money on the table. She thought about $3.41 in a ceramic pot above the stove. She thought about how different those numbers were and how they were somehow the same story. She paid the debt through Robert Plum, who handled the transaction with the county registry, and gave her the receipt on a Tuesday. It was a piece of paper, an ordinary piece of paper. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket next to the folded copy of her mother's recipe, which she still carried there, had always carried there, for reasons she'd stopped needing to explain to herself. The relief lasted about 6 hours. On Wednesday morning, she opened her door to find a man she had never seen before standing on her porch. He was well dressed for Red Hollow, city-dressed, with a leather satchel and the particular grooming of a man whose profession required him to look trustworthy. He introduced himself as representing a legal office in Denver and handed her a document before she could say anything. It was a notice of violation. Specifically, a claim that Silver Orchard Preserves had sold product that was misrepresented in quality and content to consumers in Garfield County, based on an anonymous complaint filed with the Regional Commerce Office. She read it standing in her doorway while the man waited. "What misrepresentation?" she said. "The complaint alleges that your product contains adulterants not disclosed on the label." "That's not true." "I'm just delivering the document, ma'am." Who filed the complaint? The filing is anonymous, as I said. She looked at the document. She looked at the man. She thought about Silas Mercer sitting in his warehouse across the valley, working through his list of levers, trying each one in sequence, moving to the next when the last one failed. How long do I have to respond? 21 days. She took the document. She closed the door. She stood in her kitchen and she looked at the far wall for a moment. Then she called for Noah. He appeared from the back of the house. She handed him the document. He read it faster than she'd read it, which still occasionally surprised her. He's going after the product, Noah said. Yes. Can he make it stick? Not if we document everything, every batch, every ingredient, every supplier. We need records that show exactly what went into every jar we've ever sold. She paused. Do we have that? He looked at her steadily. I've been keeping batch records since the 3rd week. She stared at him. Since the 3rd week? You told me the recipe required consistency, he said. Consistency requires records. I kept them. He went to the shelf beside the stove where he'd been keeping the account notebooks and pulled one out. Not the financial notebook, but another one, smaller, that she'd seen him writing in and had assumed was personal. He handed it to her. She opened it. Every batch, dated, volume, fruit source, any variation in the spice ratios, the cook time, the yield. In his careful handwriting, for 10 weeks. She stood holding it for a long time. You never told me you were doing this, she said. You had a lot to think about, he said. I didn't want to add to the list. She took the notebook, and she took the violation notice, and she took her coat, and she went to find Robert Plum. Robert read both documents side by side at his kitchen table, while Ruthie stood in the doorway looking worried and trying not to show it. The batch records are good, he said. Better than good, actually. This level of documentation, source, volume, process. This is the kind of record a commercial food producer would keep. It makes the complaint look exactly like what it is. Can we file a response that shuts it down? We can file a response that demonstrates the complaint is unsubstantiated. Whether it shuts it down depends on who's reading it. He tapped the document. This is Denver. This is a regional commerce office. That's outside Silas's direct sphere. He thought for a moment. Though the complaint came from somewhere, someone had to file it, even anonymously, and someone at that office had to accept it. He has reach in Denver, Mara said. He has connections, not control. He's not big enough for control in Denver, but connections. Robert set the document down. Here's what I think. I think this is the last thing he has. I think the jar situation didn't work, the debt didn't work, the Noah situation didn't work, the supply buyout only partially worked. I think he's running out of levers, and this is the most expensive one he has left, the most visible, the most risky for him. Because if we respond well and the complaint goes nowhere, it's on record that someone filed a false complaint against a legitimate business. That's not nothing. He's getting desperate, Mara said. Or he's getting angry, Robert said. Those aren't the same thing. She thought about that distinction. Desperate men miscalculate. Angry men sometimes did damage on their way down that outlasted their fall. What do we need for the response? She asked. The batch records. Letters from your suppliers confirming the fruit source and quality. If Agnes Ford would write something, a letter from the Clarendon Hotel on letterhead carries weight in Denver that a farmer's statement doesn't. He paused. And honestly, it would help if we could get a letter from Clara Hoyt. The Hoyt Ranch has a name in this region. People know it. I'll ask them, Mara said. She got up to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Robert, she said, why are you doing all of this? The filing, the document review, the advice. I haven't paid you anything. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his ink-stained hands. My son is 12 years old, he said. He came home from school last month and told me that a boy named Noah had corrected his arithmetic during lunch and explained three-way accounting to him. He looked up. Ruthie says that boy comes from nowhere, that you took him in. He picked up the documents and straightened them. I suppose I like knowing that's the kind of thing that happens in this valley. I'd like to keep it being that kind of valley. Agnes Ford's letter arrived in 4 days and was exactly what they needed, measured, professional, and devastating in its quiet authority. She described the Silver Orchard operation, the batch consistency, the quality she'd verified personally through multiple tastings across multiple visits. She described the ramp-up arrangement and the hotel's satisfaction with every delivery to date. And in the final paragraph, she wrote something that Robert read aloud twice when the letter arrived. She wrote that in 30 years of purchasing for the Clarendon Hotel, she had developed a reliable instinct for producers who prioritize genuine quality over convenience, and that Silver Orchard preserves represented the clearest example of that priority she had encountered in the mountain region. She wrote that any claim of misrepresentation in this product would require documentation she would be very interested to see, as it would contradict everything her own extensive review had established. "She knows how to write a letter," Noah said, when Robert finished reading. "She does," Mara agreed. Clara Hoyt's letter came 2 days after, handwritten on ranch stationery, and it was shorter and more direct and, in its way, equally useful. Clara wrote that she had been buying and distributing regional food products for 40 years, that she knew adulterated product when she tasted it, and that she had served Silver Orchard preserves to guests at her table, including 2 county commissioners and a federal land assessor, and none of them had died, and the federal assessor had asked for the label. "She mentioned the federal assessor," Noah said. "Yes, she did," Robert said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man recognizing a chess move. The response was filed to the Denver Regional Commerce Office on a Thursday, with all supporting documentation. Robert sent it registered, with a copy to the county recorder's office in Glenwood, and a copy to the Red Hollow Post, which had a public notices board where filings were sometimes shared. He shared this one. What? The public notices board at the Red Hollow Post was read by the people who came to collect their mail, and by the people who came to read the mail of the people they knew, and by the people who came to read the notices, because the notices were frequently more interesting than anything that arrived in envelopes. Within 48 hours, most of Red Hollow knew that an anonymous complaint had been filed against Silver Orchard Preserves, and within 48 hours after that, most of Red Hollow had formed an opinion about who had filed it. Nobody said Silas Mercer's name on the public notices board, but the name was in the air the way things are in the air in small towns. Present, understood, not needing to be spoken. The Saturday market that week was different. Mara arrived with her jars the same as always, and she set up her table the same as always, but people stopped differently that morning. Not just to buy. Several of them stopped to say something. A farmer named Gus Tillerman, who she'd nodded to for years but never really spoken to, came up and shook her hand without explaining why. A woman she didn't know from one of the ranches east of town bought 4 jars and said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, that she'd been meaning to try these for weeks and was glad she finally had. Edwin Whitmore came at 9 in the morning instead of his usual 11 and bought 2 jars instead of 1 and caught her eye briefly and looked away. June Platt, from the herb table next door, watched all of this with her usual penetrating attention. "He miscalculated," June said, between customers. Mara looked at her. "Silas. He spent 20 years making people afraid of him, which works well until it doesn't. The moment people decide they're more angry than they are afraid," she gestured at the market around them. "He never learned the difference between power that comes from dependency and power that comes from fear. Dependency is durable. Fear is just waiting for the right moment to become something else." Mara thought about this. "Are you going to buy a jar, June?" she said. June Platt, who had told her on her first market Saturday that she would sell 2 jars, maybe 3, and that people around here weren't going to pay $1.25 for peach jam. June Platt reached into her coin purse and bought 2 jars without another word. It was Del Harmon who told her about the ledgers. He came to the farmhouse on a Monday evening, later than people usually came, and he had a look on his face that was careful in a way that suggested what he was carrying was fragile. "There's a man in Glenwood," he said, once he was inside and the door was closed. "Name of Pryor. He worked for Silas's freight operation for 6 years, keeping accounts. He left last spring, not on good terms, from what I heard. He's been in Glenwood since, working at the feed store." Mara waited. "Cade ran into him last week," Del said. "They got to talking. Pryor had heard about the complaint against you. He got heated about it. He said some things about Silas that were specific, about the books." Del paused. "He said that Silas has been running 2 sets of accounts for his freight operation for at least 5 years. One for the county and one for himself. He said the weight discrepancies, what he did to Holt Gentry, what he did to the Arroyo Creek boys, those weren't mistakes. They were systematic. He said Pryor kept the records on both ledgers, and he still has copies." The kitchen was quiet. Noah was very still at the window. Why hasn't he said anything before? Mara asked. Because he was afraid, Dell said. Because Silas is Silas, and who was going to listen to one disgruntled clerk? He looked at her. But Pryor said, "This is what Cade told me. He said the complaint against you was the last thing. He said filing a false fraud complaint against a woman making preserves in her kitchen to cover up actual fraud in a freight empire. He said he couldn't sit on what he knew anymore." Mara sat with this for a long moment. She thought about what Robert had said. This is the most expensive lever he has left, the most risky, because if it goes nowhere, it's on record. She thought about Silas miscalculating, about anger versus desperation. "Does Pryor want to talk to Robert?" she said. "He wants to talk to whoever will listen," Dell said. "He's been wanting to talk for a year. He just needed someone to talk to." Robert Plum met with Pryor in Glenwood on a Wednesday, drove out himself, sat with the man for 2 hours. He came back with notes and a specific, careful expression she'd learned to read on him. The expression of a man who has found something solid where he expected to find sand. "The records are real," Robert said. "Detailed and damning. 5 years of systematic weight falsification, underpayment schemes, and what appears to be bribery of at least 2 county officials related to freight licensing." He set his notes on the table. "This isn't the regional commerce office. This is the state level, possibly federal, given the interstate nature of some of the freight." "What does Pryor want?" Noah asked. "He wants assurance that he's protected as a witness," Robert said. "He wants a lawyer, a real one, not me, and he wants to know that what he says gets to the right people." "Can we find him that?" "Agnes Ford," Mara said. Both of them looked at her. She said she'd dealt with men like Silas before. She has 30 years in Colorado commerce, and she knows people in Denver. She knows the right people. Mara stood up. "I'm going to write her tonight, Bob." Agnes Ford's reply came in 5 days and contained a name and an address in Denver, a law office that handled commercial fraud cases, and a note saying she had already made a preliminary inquiry and they were interested. She also included a line that Mara read twice. "I hope you understand that what you have built is larger than preserves. The community that has formed around your business is the kind of thing that does not come apart easily. Neither, I expect, will you." The fraud investigation opened officially in the 3rd week of November. It was quiet at first. These things moved slowly through channels and processes that didn't announce themselves. But the word reached Red Hollow the way most things reached Red Hollow, through the low places and around the obstacles. Silas Mercer, for the first time in 20 years, stopped coming to the market. His warehouse operation continued, but differently. More cautious, more closed. The big wagon sat in the yard for 3 days without moving. The men who worked for him were quieter when they were in town, less certain of themselves, the way the atmosphere changes around an institution when the institution starts to seem less permanent. Mara heard about it from June Platt, who heard it from the feed store owner, who heard it from a man who delivered grain to the Mercer warehouse and noticed the change in temperature. She didn't celebrate. She didn't have the energy for celebration, and she wasn't sure it was warranted yet. Investigations took time, and Silas was not a man who fell easily, and there was still too much uncertain. But she noticed something that week. She noticed it on Wednesday when she was sorting a new delivery from Holt Gentry's farm, and she noticed it again on Thursday when Ruthie came in and started the morning batch without being asked. And she noticed it on Friday when Noah sat down across from her at the kitchen table with the account notebook and said, without preamble, "We're going to hit 100 jars next week." She looked at him. "The Seaver Farm west of Glenwood, the late-season stone fruit lot I mentioned in October. I went out there with Cade last Thursday and looked at the trees. They're viable, better than viable." He turned the notebook so she could see his calculations. "If we can track Seaver and bring Ruthie's sister in 2 mornings a week," she's been asking, by the way, Ruthie hasn't mentioned it because she wasn't sure how you'd feel, "we hit 100 by the 2nd week of December." She looked at the numbers. She looked at his face. "Ruthie's sister has been asking?" she said. "For 3 weeks, he said. "Ruthie thinks you'll say no because you're worried about the overhead." "Am I wrong to worry about the overhead? At current revenue projections?" "Yes," he said. "You're wrong." She took the notebook and looked at the numbers herself. Because she always looked at the numbers herself, had from the beginning, would not stop doing that no matter how accurate Noah's projections had consistently proven to be. She turned the pages. She looked at where they'd started and where they were and the trajectory between those 2 points. It was not a straight line. It was ragged and interrupted, and it had places where it nearly went flat and places where it dropped, briefly, and then climbed again. It looked, she thought, like the kind of line that had been drawn by something that kept going even when going was hard. "All right," she said, "bring Ruthie's sister in." He wrote something in the notebook. "And Noah," she said. He looked up. "The guardianship paper should come back from Glenwood this week or next," she said. "Robert thinks by Friday." He nodded, looking back at the notebook. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud," she said. "So it was said." He was quiet for a moment, writing. Then, "I know," he said again, and this time it meant something different, the way the same two words can mean entirely different things depending on what's underneath them. Outside, the November wind came off the mountains with the particular cold authority of a season that was done arriving and had fully arrived. The peach trees on the Harmon lot were bare sticks against the sky. The kitchen was warm. The jars on the shelf caught what light there was and held it. $240 had become 100 jars a week, had become an investigation in Denver, had become a name on a guardianship document coming back from Glenwood by Friday. The woman who had started with 3 crumpled dollars in a ceramic pot had not become someone else. She was still Mara Ellison, still the widow, still the woman Silas Mercer had laughed at on the road. But something around her had shifted, not in her character, not in who she was, but in the density of the ground she stood on. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like something that would hold. She reached for the pen and wrote a letter to Agnes Ford, confirming that Silver Orchard Preserves would reach 100 jars per week by the second week of December, as agreed, and thanking her for the name of the law office in Denver, which she expected would be of considerable consequence to a number of people in the Red Hollow Valley. She sealed it. She gave it to Noah to take to the post. He put on his coat and went without being asked anything further, which was, she thought, the simplest and most complete definition she had found for what it meant to trust someone. Part 5. The Storm That Created a Legacy. The guardianship paper came back on a Thursday, not a Friday, as Robert had predicted, which meant Noah was in the yard stacking empty crates when Mara opened the envelope and read it alone at the kitchen table. It was official. Stamped, signed, registered with the County of Garfield, State of Colorado. Noah James Briggs, minor, placed under the legal guardianship of Mara Ellen Ellison, resident of Red Hollow, Colorado. Effective the 14th of November, 1891. She sat with it for a while. She wasn't sure what she expected to feel. Relief, maybe? Or the clean satisfaction of something finished. What she actually felt was more complicated than either of those. It felt like standing on a floor you'd been testing with one foot for months, and finally putting your full weight on it and finding it held. She folded the paper carefully. She put it in the trunk at the foot of the bed, next to the church bulletin with her mother's recipe, which was the only place she kept things that were not replaceable. Then she went out to the yard and told Noah. He was lifting a crate when she said it. He set the crate down. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the crate, at his hands on it, at something in the middle distance for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They stood there for a second in the cold November yard, the mountains behind him going white at the peaks, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more was needed. Then he picked the crate back up and she went inside to start the afternoon batch, and that was that. Except it wasn't that at all, and they both knew it, and the knowing was enough. December came in cold and deliberate, the way Colorado winters arrived in the high valleys. Not with drama, but with inevitability, the temperature dropping 5 degrees every few days, until one morning you woke up and the world was a different place than it had been in October. And there was no single moment you could point to when the change happened. Silver Orchard Preserves hit 103 jars in the second week of December. Mara counted them herself, which she still did despite Noah's running tallies, because some things you needed to verify with your own hands. Ruthie's sister, whose name was Bee, and who was 28 and had 3 children and an appetite for work that put most people to shame, had been coming in 4 mornings a week since the first of the month. She'd taken to the recipe with the particular confidence of someone who has been cooking serious food all her life and is relieved to finally be cooking it for a reason. She and Ruthie had a rhythm in the kitchen that Mara recognized as sisterhood, the kind of shorthand communication that only exists between people who grew up in the same house, who know each other's habits the way you know your own breathing. They were loud sometimes. Mara, who had run a quiet kitchen by herself for years, had to adjust to this. She did adjust, in the end, because the alternative was asking them to be smaller than they were, and she had spent enough of her own life being asked that. The Clarendon Hotel's first formal delivery went out on December 15th, packed into a crate lined with straw that Noah had assembled with the focused precision he brought to anything that was going somewhere. He couldn't follow it to make sure it arrived correctly. 42 jars, the first installment of the ramp-up arrangement Agnes Ford had agreed to. Mara checked every seal twice before he packed them. He let her, without comment. The delivery driver was a man named Stu Calhoun, who ran an independent freight wagon between Red Hollow and the rail connection at Glenwood. Independent meaning he was not affiliated with Ridgeline Freight, which Mara had verified before she'd given him a single jar to carry. He was a careful driver and a quiet man, and he took the crate like it was something that mattered, which she supposed it was. She stood in the road and watched the wagon go. 42 jars, Noah said from beside her. I know. The Clarendon serves roughly 200 guests on any given weekend night, he said. If each table gets a jar and returns it half empty, that's a word-of-mouth network that... Noah, she said. He stopped. Let me watch the wagon for a minute, she said. He was quiet. The wagon got smaller down the road. The mountains held the sky on their shoulders the way they always did, indifferent and enormous, and somehow steadying. All right, he said, watch the wagon. She watched it until it turned at the road's bend and disappeared, and then she went back inside because there was an afternoon batch to start, and B was waiting on the next sorted crate, and the notebooks didn't write themselves. The investigation into Silas Mercer's operation moved the way. Official things moved, slowly, through offices and correspondence, and the deliberate machinery of law that ground fine but required patience from everyone waiting for it to finish grinding. Robert Plum got updates from the Denver law office through a contact he wouldn't name specifically but who he described as reliable, and he passed what he could to Mara in weekly summaries that were always shorter than she wanted them to be. In January, the State Commerce Office formally opened a fraud investigation into Ridgeline Freight and its associated enterprises. In February, 2 county officials in neighboring Pitkin County were suspended pending inquiry into their roles in licensing irregularities connected to Mercer's freight routes. In March, a federal examiner arrived in Glenwood and spent 2 weeks reviewing records. During all of this, Silas Mercer remained in Red Hollow. He did not leave. He did not publicly respond to any of it. He continued to appear at his warehouse in the mornings and leave in the evenings. And if the operation inside had contracted, fewer wagons moving, fewer men working, the volume of commerce visibly diminished, he gave no outward sign that he considered this anything more than a temporary adjustment. Mara found this harder to deal with than she would have expected. She had imagined, in the weeks after the investigation opened, that there would be some visible reckoning, something she could point to and say, there, that's it, it's done. But reality didn't work that way, and she knew it didn't work that way, and knowing it didn't make the waiting easier. She said as much to Dottie one evening in late January. He's still there, she said, every morning, every evening, like nothing's changed. A lot has changed, Dottie said, not visibly. Mara, he went after your supply chain. He went after your materials. He went after your debt. He went after Noah. He filed a false fraud complaint that is now on record with his name attached to it because Pryor's testimony established who directed it. Dottie poured coffee and set the cup down firmly. Each one of those things failed. A man like Silas Mercer has run this valley for 20 years by being the person things don't fail for. He's still standing in his warehouse every morning because he doesn't know what else to do. That's not strength. That's a man who's run out of moves and hasn't admitted it to himself yet. Mara thought about this. It doesn't feel finished, she said. It never feels finished, Dottie said. That's the part nobody tells you. You fight something for months and then it stops being a fight and becomes a process, and you're standing there still braced for impact, and the impact is just paperwork somewhere in an office you'll never see. She shrugged. The world ends in paperwork. That's how it usually goes. It was in February, on a Tuesday, that something happened which was not paperwork and which Mara would think about for years afterward. She was at the market. She still came every Saturday, always would. It was where the business had started, and she was not a person who forgot where things started. and she was setting up her table when she heard a commotion at the far end of the market square. Not a violent commotion, not shouting, more like the specific rustling sound a crowd makes when it's turning to look at something. Silas Mercer was walking through the market. He walked the way he always had, straight-backed, deliberate, the walk of a man who expected space to open up in front of him. And for a moment, it did, the way it always had, because 20 years of a certain kind of presence doesn't evaporate in 4 months. But something was different, and Mara could see it from her table 40 feet away, and she thought most of the people in the market could see it too, even if they couldn't have named what it was. He walked through the market, and people stepped aside the way they always had, but they didn't look away. They watched him. Not with fear, with that other thing, that thing June Platt had described, anger that has finished being afraid of itself. He passed within 10 feet of Mara's table. He did not look at her. Or he looked, and she couldn't tell because she kept her eyes on her jars, straightening them, not because they needed straightening, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Her heart was going the way it always went around him, harder than she wanted it to, with a speed she couldn't fully control. He walked past. He kept walking. He reached the far end of the market, and he turned and he left. June Platt, from the next table, said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then, "He didn't buy anything." "No," Mara said. "He's never come to this market without buying from at least 4 vendors," June said. "He comes to be seen buying, to remind people they need him." She paused. "He came today to be seen, but he forgot that being seen isn't the same as being needed." Mara looked at the end of the market square where he'd gone. "He'll be back," she said. "Men like that don't just—" "Some of them do," June said, and there was something in her voice that was neither satisfied nor sad, but was very old, the tone of someone who has watched a long time and has learned that some things end not with a crash, but with a walk through an empty market on a Tuesday morning in February. Some of them just run out of room and get quiet about it. Well, the formal conclusion of the Ridgeline freight investigation came in April, after the snow had started pulling back from the lower elevations, and the peach trees on the Harmon lot were showing their first blush of new growth, small, tentative, the kind of buds that don't make promises yet but suggest them. 3 charges: systematic fraud in commercial weight reporting, bribery of county officials, and deliberate misrepresentation of freight contracts, affecting at least 14 farming operations across 2 counties. The Denver law office had been thorough, and Pryor had been thorough, and the federal examiner's 2 weeks in Glenwood had been, apparently, very productive. Silas Mercer settled. He did not stand trial. He paid restitution. The amount was not made public, but Robert, through his contact, indicated it was substantial. And he surrendered his freight licensing across the state, which meant that Ridgeline Freight, as a functioning enterprise, was finished. He was not imprisoned. That was the part that sat uncomfortably with some people, Mara included. She said so to Robert. "He paid money, and he lost his license," she said. "That's it." "He lost everything he built over 20 years, Robert said. "The licensing, the reputation, the position in this valley. In a valley like this, that's not nothing." "It's not prison." "No," Robert said. "It's not prison. The law is imperfect. You know that." She did know that. She'd known it before this, known it in the way that people who don't have money or connections learn the imperfections of the law early and carry the knowledge as a kind of low-grade grief they've mostly made peace with. "Does he stay?" she asked. "I don't know," Robert said. "I'm not sure he knows." Silas Mercer left Red Hollow in May. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't hold a sale or close his warehouse with ceremony. One morning, the warehouse was locked, and his house on the north side of town was empty, and his wagon was gone, and that was the sum total of his departure. Someone said he'd gone to Denver. Someone else said he'd gone further, to one of the territories, somewhere the name Mercer didn't arrive before he did. Mara heard about it from Dottie, who heard it from the feed store owner, who'd seen the locked warehouse on a Wednesday morning and asked around. She sat with the news for a while. She tried to find the feeling she thought she was supposed to have, triumph or closure, or the satisfied weight of a concluded thing. She found something smaller and more honest than any of those. Relief, plain and tired. The relief of a person who has been holding themselves braced for a long time and finally feels the thing they were bracing against go quiet. "Good riddance," Ruthie said when Mara told her. Bea said something considerably more pointed, which Mara pretended not to hear, and which made Ruthie cover her mouth. Noah said nothing when she told him. He was at the kitchen table with the spring production projections, and he looked up and listened and looked back down at his work. And after a moment he said, "The Seaver farm is going to have an early crop. Better to go out there next week rather than wait." "I know," she said. "I thought you'd want to know sooner rather than later." "I already knew," she said. "I was going to go Thursday." He nodded. He went back to his numbers. She went back to hers. Spring in the Red Hollow Valley was not gentle. It came in fits and reversals, a warm week followed by 3 cold days, followed by mud, followed by a hard frost that threatened the early buds and sent every farmer who'd been optimistic back into the posture of worried waiting. That was the natural condition of agricultural life. The peach trees on the Harmon lot lost some of their first blooms to a late freeze in March, and Cade stood in his orchard on the morning after and looked at the damage with an expression that Mara recognized from the morning after the hailstorm. That particular human face that is working very hard to absorb a loss it wasn't ready for. She found him there when she came to assess the Harmon supply for the spring production schedule. "How bad?" she asked. "West block is maybe 40%, he said. "East side is better. I don't know yet." "We'll adjust," she said. He looked at her. "You're not worried?" "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not going to stand here being worried when I could be in the East block counting buds." He almost smiled. "Go count the buds then." She counted the buds. The East block was better than his first estimate, closer to 60% viability, which combined with the Seaver Farm's early projections and Holt Gentry's West Side trees that Noah had correctly assessed back in the fall as more viable than expected, meant that the spring supply would be reduced but not devastated. She adjusted the production schedule. She talked to Agnes Ford, who adjusted the delivery schedule. She talked to Vera Stills in Ridgecrest, who had been stocking Silver Orchard on her shelves since January and had 3 customers on a waiting list. She talked to Robert Plum about whether the farming contracts needed updating for a partial crop scenario, and Robert spent an afternoon with the language and came back with an amendment that she brought to each farmer individually and explained in plain terms. Every single one of them signed the amendment without requiring anything in return. That was the part that stayed with her. Not a single one of them took the reduced crop season as an opportunity to renegotiate or walk away. Cade Harmon, who had been cautious about the original contract, signed the amendment faster than he'd signed anything. She asked him why. He shrugged, which was his equivalent of a long speech. "Because you didn't look for a way out of the arrangement when the freeze hit," he said. "You looked for a way to keep it working. That's not nothing." She thought about what Dottie had said in the very beginning. You need to start thinking like a business. She had done that, or tried to do it, imperfectly, with a lot of errors she'd rather not count. But she thought maybe she'd also done something that wasn't about business, exactly. Something about the way you treat people when you have more leverage than they do, about whether the leverage changes you or whether you stay the same person you were when you had nothing. She hadn't always gotten that right. She'd been short with people when she was scared, inflexible when she should have bent, slow to ask for help in ways that cost other people something. These were not fatal flaws, but they were hers, and she knew them. The thing about building something from damage, she had come to understand, was that it didn't make you perfect. It just made you more familiar with what you were actually made of. And what she was made of was imperfect, impatient, proud in ways that occasionally hurt her, stubborn in ways that occasionally saved her, and unwilling, in the end, to let any of those qualities be the thing that defined what she built. By June, Silver Orchard Preserves was supplying 4 hotels in Colorado, the Clarendon and 3 others that Agnes Ford had facilitated introductions to, each introduction coming with a note in Agnes's handwriting that was brief and exacting and better than any advertisement Mara could have afforded. The jars were coming out of the kitchen at 115 per week, with Ruthie and Bea running morning production and Mara handling quality control and special batches, and the particular problem of consistency that grew more complex as volume grew. She hired a 3rd kitchen worker in June, a woman named Pearl Seaver, who was Holt Gentry's cousin by marriage and had been making preserves for her own family for years, and who came with opinions about spice ratios that she stated immediately and without apology, and which Mara found annoying for approximately 2 weeks before she realized that Pearl was right about the cardamom and adjusted the recipe accordingly. Not dramatically, a 1/4 teaspoon per 6-quart batch. But it was better, and Mara said so, and Pearl looked quietly satisfied in the way people look when they've been correct and had the correctness acknowledged. Noah managed the supply chain. That was the only way she could describe what he did by that point, because what had started as keeping the account notebook had expanded into something she couldn't have done without him. Coordinating the farmers' delivery schedules, projecting yield from early bloom counts, tracking hotel inventory drawdown so they could anticipate reorder requests before they arrived. I was 13 now, or possibly 12. Still, she'd finally asked him when his birthday was, and he told her it was sometime in August, but he wasn't certain of the exact date, and she'd decided they would celebrate on the 15th because 15 was a good number and certainty was overrated. "We should talk about a storage building," he said one evening in late June. She looked up from the week's accounts. "We're running out of space for the glass stock," he said. "The Grand Junction order is coming Friday, and there's nowhere to put it that isn't the kitchen, and the kitchen is already up." "I know what the kitchen is," she said. "A storage building doesn't have to be large," he said. "Del Harmon said there's old lumber on his property from the barn they took down last fall. He'd sell it cheap." "How cheap?" "I asked him already," Noah said. $14 for everything we'd need." She looked at him. "You asked him already." "I was out there Thursday for the supply count," he said. "It seemed efficient." She felt the same feeling she sometimes felt around this boy. Not quite amusement, not quite exasperation, something that lived in the territory between them and had its own particular warmth. "All right," she said, "get the lumber." Kate Harmon and Holt Gentry built the storage building in 3 days in July, working mornings before the heat of the afternoon made outdoor work punishing. They refused payment, both of them, in the same way Robert had refused payment. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just a flat refusal and a change of subject. Mara brought them lunch both days and didn't argue about the money because she had learned, finally, the difference between accepting help and surrendering to it. The storage building was 12 feet by 14, plain wood, with a good roof and a door that closed properly. Noah organized the interior with a thoroughness that she chose not to comment on because commenting on it would have required admitting that she herself would have left it less organized and the organization mattered. On the day they finished it, they all stood outside it for a moment. Mara, Noah, Ruthie, Bea, Pearl, Cade, Holt, Robert Plum, and Dottie, who had come without being specifically invited and whose presence was appropriate for exactly that reason. Nobody made a speech. Dottie had brought a pie, which was not a peach pie because they had all had enough peaches to last a while, but a gooseberry pie, and she cut it on the tailgate of her wagon and handed pieces around on the plates she'd brought, because Dottie always brought plates, had always been the person who remembered the plates. Mara stood with her piece of pie and looked at the building. It was not beautiful. The lumber was old and slightly mismatched, and the door hung about 3 degrees off true, but it was solid, and it was hers, and it would hold what she needed it to hold. "Mara," Holt said from beside her. He was not a man who used words for decoration, which is why she paid attention when he used them. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Last October, when you came to my farm and you said you couldn't match Silas's 20 cents, but you weren't going to insult me by trying," he stopped. "Did you know then that it would come to this?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the $3 on the table and the 11 jars on a Saturday, and the night she'd sat alone in the kitchen with 240 on a page and a panic she wouldn't let happen. "No," she said. He nodded. "Then how did you know to keep going?" She thought about this for a long time, long enough that Holt began to look like he regretted asking. "I didn't know it would work," she said. "I knew that stopping felt worse than the alternative." She paused. "And I had the recipe, my mother's recipe. And I knew the recipe was right, that the thing I was making was genuinely good, not just because I needed it to be good, because I could taste it, and it was." She looked at the storage building. "That's all I had, really, the recipe and the knowledge that the thing was real. Everything else, the farmers, the contracts, Noah, the hotels in Denver, that came because I didn't stop." Holt looked at his pie. "Simple as that." "Not simple at all," she said. "Just that." August came with its particular combination of heat and color, the valley going gold and russet, the orchards heavy with the second season fruit, the sky that deep blue that only existed in the mountains in late summer and that Mara had missed desperately during the years she'd spent trying not to notice how beautiful the place she was struggling in actually was. Noah's birthday, or the birthday they had agreed on, the 15th, fell on a Thursday. Mara made a cake, which she was not as good at as she was at preserves, but which she completed without disaster. And Ruthie and Bee came over in the evening, and Pearl came with her husband, who turned out to be a man of extremely limited conversation, but considerable skill at card tricks, which he demonstrated for an hour to everyone's increasing delight. Noah turned 13, probably, or possibly 12 still, and he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by people who had found their way into this kitchen by different roads and stayed, and he ate 2 pieces of cake and beat Robert Plum at cards 3 times, and said almost nothing all evening, the way he said almost nothing when he was happiest. After everyone had gone, he was at the table with the production projections for the fall season, because Noah did not stop working because it was his birthday, and Mara was cleaning up the cake plates. "Good birthday?" she asked. He considered it with his usual seriousness. "Yes. Pearl's husband is something, with those cards." "He's been doing it for 40 years, Noah said. "You can tell because he doesn't think about it anymore. The hands just know." She set down the plates and looked at him. "How do you know he's been doing it 40 years? "I asked him while you were cutting the cake." She shook her head slowly. "Noah," she said. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Just—" She looked for the word and didn't find one that was exact. "Nothing." He went back to his projections. She went back to the plates. Outside the kitchen window, the valley was dark in the way the valley got in August. A darkness that wasn't quite black, that had a warmth in it from the day's heat still releasing from the earth. The mountains a darker shade against a dark sky. The peach trees on the Harmon lot were invisible out there, but present. The way things you know well are present even when you can't see them. She thought about a year ago. She thought about hailstorms and $3.41 and a wagon full of damaged fruit and a man on a big rig laughing at her in the road. She thought about what you couldn't have told her then, that the damage was where it started, that the bruising was the beginning of the thing and not the end of it, that her mother's recipe had been right about all of it, including the part about trusting the vinegar. She thought about the people in this valley who had something now that they didn't have before a hailstorm on a Tuesday. Ruthie, with steady income and her sister working beside her. The Harmon brothers, with a buyer who didn't short their weight. Holt Gentry, who signed things and meant them. Robert Plum, whose daughter would ask him years later what the most important thing he'd done in Red Hollow was, and who would tell her about a filing fee he'd paid himself because some things are not transactions. Dottie, whose wagon had been borrowed and returned and borrowed again until the borrowing became so routine that the distinction between hers and Mara's had softened at the edges the way the distinction between 2 streams softens where they meet. And Noah, who had appeared on a porch in the dark with nothing, and who now sat at a kitchen table in August doing fall production projections for a company that was, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable ongoing effort, becoming something. She thought about what Silas Mercer had been trying to protect all those months. His position, his control, the architecture of dependency he'd built over 20 years in this valley. She thought about how completely he'd misunderstood what he was dealing with, not because he was stupid, he wasn't stupid, but because the thing he was trying to destroy was not the kind of thing his tools were designed to destroy. You couldn't buy it, you couldn't freight it. You couldn't file a complaint against it with the regional commerce office. You couldn't threaten it through a landlord or starve it through a jar supplier, because it wasn't in the jars and it wasn't in the supply chain, and it wasn't, finally, even in the recipe. It was in the way a boy with no certain last name looked up from a bowl of 2 loose preserves and went completely still and said, "That's the best thing I've ever had." It was in the way Cade Harmon had signed a contract amendment without requiring anything in return. It was in the way Clara Hoyt said, "This is worth talking about," and then made it her business to make sure people talked. It was in the way Dottie Plum always brought plates. These were not things you could acquire or manufacture. They accreted, slowly, around something real. On a morning in late August, Mara walked out to the edge of the Harmon lot before the workday started, before the kitchen was warm and the day had its demands, while the air still had that cool clarity that belonged only to the hour before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The peach trees were in their full late summer weight, branches bowed with fruit that was not ripe yet but was getting there. Another 3 weeks, maybe 4, and then the harvest, and then the sorting, and then the long, careful work of turning what the season had given them into something that would outlast the season. She stood there for a while. The mountains did what mountains do, held still while everything else moved, provided a scale that made human troubles feel appropriately sized without making them feel small. There was a difference. She'd learned that difference somewhere in the past year and couldn't have said exactly when. She was not finished. That was the thing about having built something real. You didn't finish it, you just kept building, and the building was the point, not the finishing. There would be another contract to negotiate, and another frost to survive, and another year of trying to hit the numbers, Noah projected, and apologizing to farmers when you fell short, and being honest about why, and then doing better. There would be decisions she'd make wrong, and have to unmake, and make again differently. There would be days when the kitchen was too hot, and the margins were too thin, and the thing felt less like a business, and more like a collection of problems held together by stubbornness, and a recipe written in pencil on the back of a church bulletin. There would be all of that, and it would be difficult, and she would manage it. She thought about what you saw when you looked at damaged fruit. Most people saw what it had been, what it should have been, what the storm had taken from it. They saw the loss, which was real, and they stopped there. Her mother had seen something else. She had looked at the bruising and the splits and the too early ripeness that the damage forced, and she had seen what the damage had made possible. The concentrated sugar, the broken down flesh that took spice differently, the slight ferment that added something you couldn't get from perfect fruit because perfect fruit didn't have it. She had seen that the damage was not only loss, that it had made something that couldn't have existed any other way. Mara had spent a year learning that same lesson, applied to things larger than peaches. The sun came over the eastern ridge, the light hit the orchard, and the trees went from shadow shape to particular, individual, distinct. This branch bending this way, this fruit catching light at this angle, this one tree that always leafed later than the others and was always the last to drop and fall, a latecomer and a long stayer. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, where the stove would need lighting and the morning batch wouldn't start itself, and Noah would already be at the table with the production notebook, probably 2 pages ahead of where she'd left him last night, because Noah did not stop and would not stop, and she had learned to stop being surprised by that and start being grateful for it. The screen door opened before she reached it. Noah stood in the doorway. He had the account notebook in his hand, and his hair was still from sleep, and he was wearing the jacket she'd bought him in April that was already starting to be slightly too short in the sleeves because he was growing the way boys grow, suddenly, as if they're making up for lost time. "The Seaver delivery came early," he said. "It's on the porch. And B sent word she'll be late, so Ruthie's starting on her own, and she says she needs you to do the first sugar measurement because B usually does that, and Ruthie doesn't trust herself with it." "Tell Ruthie she can trust herself," Mara said, climbing the porch steps. "I told her. She said to tell you she'd prefer your opinion." Mara stopped on the step below him. They were eye level, which they hadn't been in October. "You're taller," she said. He looked faintly offended. "I know." "Is that my jacket you're wearing?" He looked down. It was in fact her work jacket, which he had apparently put on without noticing it wasn't his. "I'll change," he said. "Don't bother," she said. "It suits you." He went back inside. She followed him, past the Seaver crates on the porch, through the door and into the kitchen that smelled the way it always smelled now. Warm and particular, and like something that had been made with attention and care, and the specific knowledge that damaged things, handled right, could become something extraordinary. Ruthie was at the stove, and the first morning light was coming through the window over the sink, and somewhere outside a crow was arguing with the sky about something, and a year's worth of struggle and loss and stubbornness and community, and one boy on a porch, and $3 and a recipe and pencil had become this. An ordinary morning in a kitchen in Red Hollow, Colorado, where people who had found each other through difficulty were getting ready to make something good. Mara picked up the measuring cup. She started the sugar. Outside, the peach trees stood in their late summer wait, patient and ordinary and full of something worth finding, if you were willing to look at what the damage had done to them instead of looking away.